5:17 in the evening, February the 7th, 1969, Derby Midlands Station. The temperature outside has dropped to -8 Celsius and is still falling. Inside the signal box, the signalman pulls lever number 14. It does not move. He pulls again, throwing his full weight against the handle. Nothing. He checks the indicator board. The point heaters are on. They have been on since noon. The electric elements beneath the track switches are glowing orange, doing exactly what they were designed to do, melting ice, keeping the rail joints clear. And yet, the points will not move. He reaches for the telephone. What he's about to report will cascade into one of the most chaotic evenings Derby Station has ever seen. This is the story of a failure nobody predicted. A failure that exposed a blind spot in British Rail's entire winter protection strategy. Because on that freezing February night the technology worked. Every single heater functioned perfectly. The points themselves were warm, clear, free of ice. But the system that connected the signal box to those points, the long runs of mechanical rodding buried beneath platforms and stretching across the throat of the station, had frozen solid. The muscle worked. The nervous system did not. Derby Midland was no small station. Situated at the crossroads of the Midland Main Line, it served as a critical junction where routes from London St Pancras, Birmingham, Sheffield, Nottingham and Leicester all converged. 6 platforms, over 20 sets of points controlling the station throat, a signal box with more than 70 levers. By the late 1960s, the station handled over 150 train movements during the evening peak alone. Express services, semi-fast commuter trains, local stopping services, and parcels traffic all competed for paths through the station throat. Every movement depended on the precise sequencing of points and signals, and every point depended on a mechanical linkage stretching back to the signal box. On any given evening, the signalmen in that box were among the busiest on the London Midland region. Their hands never stopped moving. To understand what went wrong, you need to understand how a Victorian-era railway moves a set of points. In 1969, Derby Midland still relied on mechanical signalling. The signalman stood in his elevated box surrounded by a frame of heavy iron levers. Each lever was connected to a specific set of points or signal by a continuous run of metal rodding. These were not cables. They were rigid steel bars, linked end-to-end with compensating cranks, stretching sometimes 300, 400, even 500 yards from the lever frame to the trackside point mechanism. The system was elegant in its simplicity. Pull the lever, the rodding slides laterally, the crank transfers the motion, the point blades move. No electricity required, no hydraulics, no motors, just steel, leverage and human muscle. The system had worked reliably since the 1870s. Through 2 world wars, through floods and heat waves and the worst that British weather could deliver, the rodding had kept moving. Indeed, but it had one fundamental vulnerability that decades of winter operations had somehow failed to fully expose. The rodding ran through channels, open channels, partially enclosed troughs, and in some places through tubes beneath platforms. Where these channels passed under structures, through drainage paths, or alongside retaining walls, moisture collected. On a normal winter day, this was manageable. The rodding moved frequently enough to break any thin ice that formed. The mechanical action itself was a kind of self-clearing process. Movement kept the system alive, stillness killed it. But February 1969 was not a normal winter day. The cold had arrived gradually. For 3 days prior, temperatures across the East Midlands had hovered just above freezing during the day and dropped to -4 or -5 overnight. Moisture had been accumulating in the rodding channels. Condensation from warmer daytime air meeting cold steel had left a thin film of water on every surface. The daily cycle of marginal thawing and overnight freezing had been building layers of ice, each one thicker than the last, each one tightening the grip on the rodding just a fraction more. Then, on the 7th, the temperature plunged. By mid-afternoon, it was -6. By the time the evening rush began, -8. And it was still dropping. The Arctic air mass that had been building over Scandinavia for a week had finally pushed south across the North Sea and settled over the Midlands with brutal finality. The water that had gathered over 3 days froze, not on the points. The heaters took care of those. It froze along the rodding runs, in the compensating cranks, around the pivot pins, inside the guide tubes beneath platform 3, Every mechanical joint in the system seized. The steel contracted in the cold, tightening tolerances that were already marginal. Grease thickened to the consistency of tar. Water that had seeped into the smallest gaps between moving parts turned to ice and locked them rigid. The first sign of trouble came at approximately 4:45 in the afternoon. A signalman attempted to set the road for an inbound service from Birmingham. Lever 12 resisted. He applied more force. The lever moved part way, then stuck. The points had shifted perhaps 2 inches of the required 4-inch throw, not enough. The detection circuit showed the points out of correspondence. The signal stayed red. He tried again. This time, the lever would not move at all. The rodding had locked completely. Within 15 minutes, 3 more levers had seized. By 5 o'clock, the signal box was losing control of the station throat. The complex junction where multiple lines converged into the platform approaches was becoming unmovable. Points that needed to be reversed for conflicting movements were stuck in one position. The signalman could route trains into certain platforms, but he could not route them out again. Or he could clear a departure path, but not set up the next arrival. The timetable depended on the rapid sequencing of point movements to thread trains through the throat and into the correct platforms. On a normal evening, the signalman might reverse a set of points 40 or 50 times in an hour, each movement taking a few seconds. It was a rhythm, almost musical. Pull, slide, lock. Pull, slide, lock. Now that rhythm was broken. When that sequencing collapsed, everything collapsed with it. By 5:15, the first delays were being announced. Platform allocation became chaotic. Trains were being held at signals outside the station because the points ahead of them could not be set. Services that had arrived could not depart because the crossover points were frozen in the wrong position. Platforms began to fill with stranded trains, their diesel engines idling in the freezing air, exhaust plumes rising into the darkness. The station foreman called for manual assistance. Every available hand was summoned. Permanent way staff, maintenance fitters, even off-duty workers who happened to be at the station were pressed into service. This meant sending men out onto the track with crowbars, kettles of hot water, and paraffin torches to physically free each seized rodding joint by hand. It was brutal work. The temperature was still falling. The wind cut across the open track at the station approaches, funneled between the buildings and the retaining walls of the cutting. The men worked in darkness, the only light coming from their hand lanterns and the yellow glow of the station lamps overhead. They crouched beside the track in heavy coats and gloves, pouring boiling water over frozen cranks, hammering at pivot pins with wooden mallets to avoid damaging the mechanism, trying to free enough movement in the rodding to allow one lever to complete its throw. The boiling water steamed for a few seconds, then cooled, then froze. Each point took between 10 and 20 minutes to free manually, and freeing it once was no guarantee it would stay free. The moment the rodding stopped moving, the cold began seizing it again. Within 5 minutes of a successful clearance, the joints could lock once more. Men had to be stationed at critical junctions, continuously working the rodding back and forth to prevent refreezing. It was a holding action, not a solution. At the peak of the chaos, between 5:30 and 6:30, the station was operating at perhaps a quarter of its normal capacity. Trains that should have taken 2 minutes to pass through the station area were taking 15 or 20. Some services were terminated short of Derby, and passengers told to find alternative transport. Others were held at Spondon or Duffield, waiting for a path that might not open for an hour. A handful of services were cancelled entirely. Passengers on the platforms knew nothing of rodding or compensating cranks. They saw only the unexplained paralysis of a major station. Departure boards flickered with changing times. Announcements contradicted each other as the situation shifted minute by minute. The waiting rooms filled beyond capacity. People stood in the corridors on the concourse, huddled against the cold that seeped through the Victorian brickwork. Some commuters waited over 2 hours for services that normally ran every 30 minutes. Others gave up entirely, filing out of the station into the bitter cold to find buses or telephone for lifts home. The car parks emptied slowly as those who had driven to the station in the morning returned to collect vehicles they had expected to leave overnight. The irony was visible to anyone who looked down at the track. The point heaters were working. You could see the clear patches of rail where the heating elements had kept the ice at bay. The switchblades themselves moved freely when pushed by hand. The problem was everything between the signal box and those blades. 300 yards of Victorian-era mechanical linkage, designed in an era when -8 was considered an act of God rather than a planning parameter. British Rail had invested considerably in point heating during the 1960s. After several harsh winters in the late 50s and early 60s, particularly the devastating winter of 1962-63, a programme of installing electric point heaters had been rolled out across the network. Derby was one of the beneficiary stations. The heaters were considered the solution to winter point failures. They were the modern answer to an old problem, and they were, for the points. Nobody had adequately considered the rodding. In a modern power-operated signalling system, this problem would not exist. Electric or hydraulic point motors sit directly beside the points they control. There is no rodding, no mechanical linkage stretching hundreds of yards through exposed channels. The control signal travels by wire, not by steel bar. But in 1969, large portions of the British network, including major stations like Derby, still relied on mechanical frames installed in the Victorian or Edwardian periods. Some of these lever frames dated back to the 1880s. The modernisation programme was underway, but it moved slowly. Derby would not receive full power signalling for several more years. The events of February the 7th forced a reconsideration. British Rail's London Midland region engineers filed a detailed report on the incident. The conclusion was uncomfortable but clear. Point heaters alone were not a complete winter protection solution for mechanically signalled locations. The entire linkage path from lever frame to point blade needed protection. This meant either heating the rodding channels themselves, which was expensive and technically complex, or enclosing them against moisture ingress, or applying antifreeze compounds to critical joints at regular intervals, or, most effectively, accelerating the conversion to power operation. Each option had drawbacks. Heating rodding channels would require running electrical cables along hundreds of yards of exposed infrastructure. Enclosing the channels risked trapping moisture rather than excluding it. Antifreeze compounds needed constant reapplication and could attract ballast contamination. Power signalling was the right answer, but it required complete resignaling of the station, a project measured in years and millions of pounds. In the short term, Derby adopted a regime of preventive rodding maintenance during cold spells. Men were assigned to walk the rodding runs during the day, working each joint manually, applying oil and antifreeze mixture to pivot points, and clearing accumulated water from channels before it could freeze. It was labour-intensive and imperfect, but it reduced the risk. When temperatures were forecast to drop below -5, additional staff were called in for overnight rodding patrols. The longer-term answer was the one everyone already knew. Mechanical signalling had to go. The Derby incident became one of many data points in the argument for accelerated modernisation. Every frozen rodding run, every 2-hour delay, every stranded commuter was evidence that the Victorian infrastructure could not reliably serve a modern railway in extreme conditions. But modernisation took time, it took money, it took political will, and in 1969, all three were in short supply. British Rail was operating under severe financial constraints. The beaching cuts had reshaped the network but not solved its funding problems. Investment in signalling competed with investment in rolling stock, track renewal, and station improvements. Resignaling a major junction like Derby could cost several £1 million, equivalent to tens of millions in modern money. The business case was strong, but the queue was long. Dozens of stations across the network needed the same treatment. Derby waited. It waited through the winter of 1969. It waited through the cold spells of the early 70s, and each time the temperature dropped, the same men walked the same rodding channels with the same kettles and the same crowbars. Meanwhile, the men with crowbars and kettles continued their winter patrols. Every cold night they walked the rodding channels in darkness, working the joints, fighting the frost with boiling water and brute force. They knew every crank, every pivot, every low point where water gathered. They could tell by the resistance in a joint whether it had an hour of freedom left or 5 minutes. It was unglamorous work. No one wrote about it in the newspapers. No one photographed it for the railway magazines, but it kept the trains moving. Barely, sometimes. Imperfectly, always, but moving. The lesson of Derby on February the 7th, 1969, was not that technology failed. The technology worked exactly as designed. The heaters heated, the points were clear, The lesson was that a system is only as strong as its weakest component, and the weakest component was the one nobody thought to protect. 300 yards of iron and steel lying in an open channel, connecting a lever to a blade. The simplest part of the system, and the one that brought everything to a halt. It is a lesson that extends well beyond railways. In any complex system, the failure point is rarely where you expect it. It is rarely the sophisticated component, the expensive technology, the carefully engineered solution. It is the connecting piece, the linkage, the forgotten intermediate, the thing in between that everyone assumes will simply work because it always has. You protect the critical endpoints and forget the path between them. On the night of February the 7th, the point heaters glowed orange in the darkness. The switchblades sat warm and ready, and 300 yards away, a signalman pulled a lever that would not move. The points were ready, the railway was not.